I already made multiple TikTok videos on this subject, but I figured a single comprehensive video would be easier to understand. And the topic is 1. Should passing as a trans person or masking as an autistic person be considered privileges? And 2. Should they be obligated to use those privileges to help their communities? And at least intersectionally, they should not be considered privileges, as trans people are not a privileged class, and autistic people are not a privileged class. If anything, they are an oppressed class, which would mean that the survival tactics that arise out of those identities would not be considered intersectional privileges. And for those of you that are not familiar with the term intersectionality, I might do a future video on it, but I highly suggest you look into it yourself. And when I say things like passing and masking are less intersectional privileges and more survival tactics, I'm referring to the way that they're used in response to societal pressures to conform, either to things like gender roles or neurotypical behaviors. So even if you're not trying to determine whether these things are intersectional privileges, but just if they manifest as advantages for these individuals, the answer is, it depends. Sometimes passing as a trans person or masking as an autistic person can come with their share of benefits, which will help an individual, but they can also manifest as disadvantages. For example, within the trans community, sometimes presenting yourself in a way that passes can mean subjecting yourself to increased dysphoria or closeting, and could also result in them putting themselves at greater risk due to factors like the trans panic response. Which, if you're not familiar with, is the idea that trans people should be met with violence if they are outed as trans in a situation that you believed that they were cis. Which is ironic because these situations only arise out of trans people trying to conform to societal norms surrounding gender. So in some scenarios, passing as a trans person can even put you at greater risk, which I would not consider an advantage. And then, looking at the autistic community, not only is masking exhausting itself and can lead to burnout, but the constant expectation for autistics to mask their neurodivergency can often lead to people not knowing how to unmask, which they then have to learn for their own health. And even those who can mask in the community often have their experiences as an autistic person denied or ignored entirely. For example, you can't be autistic, I've seen you make eye contact, or you can't be autistic, you're not like this other autistic person I know. And it's not just the experiences of the autistic person that's being denied simply because they can mask. This often leads to them being denied a diagnosis or community support, which can be extremely important. So, to recap, passing and masking are not privileges in the intersectional sense, and they don't even necessarily function as advantages. They can just as easily function as disadvantages. So moving on to the second premise of the topic, should those with the capacity to pass or to mask be obligated to use them for their communities? And the first thing I want to say on this is, as these survival tactics are rooted in societal expectations to conform, we need to acknowledge those societal pressures to conform. And if your goal is to fight for the liberation of these groups, your preferred method should not be contributing to the detrimental pressures of your group to conform. But, that being said, the society we live in is still cis-heteronormative, it's still ableist, and it still clings to its ideas surrounding gender norms and neurotypical behaviors. And because of these reasons, society is more receptive to the voices of those who are aligned with these expectations than those who are not. But some of those who happen to pass or mask can feel disconnected from their own communities and less qualified to speak on these issues, in large part because of the invalidation that I mentioned earlier. So this is how I want to end the video. If you happen to be a trans person who passes, or an autistic person who masks, you are entirely valid and do not let anyone take that away from you. And if you feel both comfortable and safe in doing so, your advocacy and contributions to these groups really do make all the difference.